Hello and welcome to the Eternal Table, historical Italian cooking. Today we're going to be making sweet and sour wild boar. It's a recipe from 1898 by Adolfo Giaquinto from his book La Cucina di Famiglia. As I explain on the companion website to this video, theeternaltable.com, the end recipe here is a composite of 3 different recipes. The second recipe is from La Cucina Romana by Arabian, 1929. She was Giaquinto's niece. The third recipe source, also based on Giaquinto, is from Luigi Carnacina, Roma in Cucina, 1968. He was a famous Roman-born chef who trained with Escoffier. We'll be working with my composite recipe of these 3 Roman culinary authorities. The recipe is divided into 3 sections, and the first one begins with a marinade. This is a cooked marinade that has white wine at the base. You want to choose a wine that doesn't have any particular accent that's going to interfere too much with the marinade taste. So what I've chosen here is a standard Italian white supermarket wine. And I also have a rather standard white wine vinegar. The other marinade ingredients include a stalk of celery, carrot, garlic, onion, and those are all going to get minced together. And also I have in here bay leaf, which is you're going to crush it in your hand, and some cloves. Try to get the cloves that have the heads on them still. Acid-based marinades like these should be put in non-reactive containers so they don't corrode. Once you've minced the vegetables together somewhat coarsely, put them in with the marinade liquid, the bay leaf, and the clove. Put that on the stove and bring it to a boil. The recipe I have here is for 2 kilos of wild boar. And I get my wild boar from a local hunter, so that it results in a much less dry meat. Our authors tell us to tie the meat together, but then Giaquinto at the very end says that we can cut it into chunks, which I thought would be easier, and so I've done so. Let the marinade cool slightly before you mix it with the meat. Then you're going to put it into a bowl and put it into the refrigerator for 2 days. It's important that the meat is covered with the liquid at least as much as shown here. If not, simply add more wine and vinegar in that 2-to-1 ratio. This is the wild boar removed from the refrigerator after 2 days. After the first day, you might want to shift it around a little bit in the bowl while it's in the refrigerator, and then leave it for another day. Before we move on to the next phase, you want to remove the meat and dry it as well as you possibly can so that it will react well in the pan. The medium that we're going to brown the meat in is lard and some of the rendered fat from the prosciutto. The rest of the ingredients that are added while the meat is browning are pretty much the same: carrot, onion, and celery. Those 3 are going to be minced together with the garlic and then added to the meat as is indicated in the recipe. Towards the last phase of the browning, you want to add the thyme and laurel, which should be crushed a little bit. For the braising liquid, Giaquinto says it's better to use broth than water. Then in the last phase of browning, we'll need some red wine to deglaze the pan. Have your vegetables well minced, and the prosciutto cut up into relatively large-sized chunks. Melt the lard in the pan and then fry up the prosciutto with that. And now on to the browning. At a high heat, brown 1/3 of the boar with 1/3 of the vegetables. Important to let each batch get very brown at a very high heat so that it comes out like this. It should really stick well to the bottom of the pan, and with each new batch you can deglaze. The final batch has finished browning. You take a cup of red wine and deglaze the pan. Continue cooking until it has almost evaporated. Next step is to add the liquid for the braise, which is the broth or water, though I highly recommend the broth. We have the laurel and the thyme in, and we need to cover and cook until it's tender. At the end of the braising period, you're going to end up with a lot of really awful looking grease on top. Don't be dismayed because the grease does come off. If you put it into a skimming cup like this, it's actually quite easy. The grease floats to the top. So first remove the meat and set it aside, and then take the broth and put it into one of these cups. Wait until the grease rises, and then pour off the good broth. We're now ready to move into the final phase. The secret ingredient to the base of the gravy is a high-quality dark chocolate, which you will want to grind or grate well. Here's the lineup of our finishing ingredients, and the part that really gives this dish its historical taste. We have candied orange and citron peels, and this is followed by raisins, dried prunes, and sour cherries. Our final ingredients are a little bit of sugar, pine nuts that are going to be toasted, bay leaf, and a smashed garlic. The instructions say to put in the sugar with a piece of garlic and then add the liquid. I'm not quite sure what the utility is of glazing this piece of garlic, but we'll go along with it. It says to continue cooking until the sugar starts to brown. So here we have it all nice and bubbly, and it's starting to caramelize. And now we're ready to put in the chocolate and melt it into the pan. The idea of chocolate, garlic, and sugar together may not be so appealing to you, but trust me on this. As the chocolate is cooking, you'll want to stir it so that it doesn't get too brown and doesn't stick. When the chocolate has melted completely, we're going to pour the broth on top. Now, in the recipe, they make a big fuss about how thick the broth is going to be, and it's actually thicker than it seems to be here. It's not that important because it's going to be thickened then later with a starch thickener, and also the fruit will thicken it up. On a low boil, add the orange peel and citron peel. Then first you're going to add the pine nuts and raisins, because the raisins are going to be a bit harder than the other fruits. With that addition, let it boil for a while before you add the cherries and the prunes, because they're very soft and they don't need to boil for very long because they'll disintegrate. You're going to need to correct the thickness with the solution of cornstarch and vinegar. Now, I know this sounds really disgusting at this point, but trust me. All the while, the gravy is going to continue to thicken, but you do want to be careful that the fruit that you've put in doesn't start to get too soft and disintegrate, because you want to have that individual fruit bite when you're eating it. You can see here that the pieces have remained very distinct and individual, and the broth has thickened a bit more into a gravy. Place the meat into a large pot and pour the gravy over the top. Once you've poured the gravy over the top, don't stir it around too much. Let it cook, but again, you don't want that fruit to get too mushy. And once it has been cooking for a little while on the stove, it's going to continue to thicken up, and then you're ready to serve. And here it is. If you make the candied fruit peel yourself, the flavor is going to be so much different, and I have a recipe for this on my website. The website has a wealth of information about Adolfo Giaquinto, as well as the recipe from his book translated into English. And you can compare that with the recipe that I have made here, which is a composite recipe, as I said earlier on. If you're interested in Italian food, you can follow me on Instagram at Historical Italian Food, or you can go to theeternaltable.com and sign up for my newsletter. Nel frattempo, grazie e buon appetito!